Today, I'm going to talk about the other book in the Spelljammer box set, the Lorebook of the Void. This is supposedly the DM's guide for Spelljammer. Let's take a look inside it. So it has some introductions. Okay, so first of all, it talks a little bit about the kind of campaign you're going to have and how to get the players into space. And one suggestion is that they find an intact ship or helm, or at least part of one, or they might find a scroll with create minor helm on it, or a sage could hire them on some mission to get into space by a chariot drawn by swans, or on a saddle on the back of a charmed dragon, or a huge balloon, or a huge tower filled with smoke powered and ignited, the heroes on top of the tower with a cube of force that blasts the heroes into space, or a dimension ladder that continually extends up as you climb up it, the bottom rungs vanishing and the other rungs appear above. Or it could be aliens from another planet crash and then you take their ship, and there's 3 different variations of that between merchants or hostile aliens. So then it goes into the kinds of adventures you can have in space. You can go adventuring, you could go trading, pirating, there might be local navies and military, exploration or intrigue. And it occurs to me, all of this you could do with a seaborne adventure too. A lot of the rules for Spelljammer would apply equally to a seaborne campaign. You could easily adapt these rules to fit the sea. And so it talks about what kind of monsters you encounter on a world. If it's an Earth-type world or garden worlds, you would find creatures that you find on any other world. You know, creatures on a normal world. A fire world would have fire creatures like elementals and ifriti and things like that. A water world would have things like fish. An air world would have things that can fly. Air worlds in this game are not quite like gas giants. They're more like a big bubble of air that doesn't get denser as you go deeper into it like a gas giant does. And so it gives some advice about monster appearance, which is actually good advice for any campaign, because long before this came out, there were people who'd memorized the monster manual. So it recommends you change the shape of an existing monster and you can reuse it. And the example is a Grimlock, which is a humanoid thing. And if you make it look like a land squid, they don't know what they're encountering. Another example is you could take a beholder and change this Death Eye into a Detect Lie spell, and then you have a beholder who can be more social. So it talks about landfall and arriving on planets. When you land on a planet with a spaceship, you land where the DM says you landed. You don't have a choice there, but once you're there, then you can fly the ship. And the spelljamming ships fly faster than any normal magical means of travel. So you can fly pretty fast, but you can't pick from orbit where you're going to land. Now, it goes into some definitions of terms for ships, but I'm going to go over those when I go over the cards. And then there's a bunch of ships, and most of these I'm going to wait and go over them when I go over the ship cards. But this one doesn't have a ship card. The Flitter is intended to be a one-man fighter, but it doesn't have a helm that makes it fast enough or weapons or it kind of fails to be a fighter, but it's a cool idea and a great shape. The Mosquito is another one that doesn't have a card. The Dragonfly does, but not the Damselfly. Let's see, let's skip past these. Oh, and here's a bunch of different beholder ships. The one on the upper left, you can see little pods for the beholders to get in. They channel their energy into the hive mother, who then channels it into a super I-beam. Okay, there's the Nomis Sidewheeler. This thing would have a giant space hamster inside it, who would run on a treadmill, which would wind up a big rubber band, which would turn the wheel, which somehow magically makes it fly. The gnomes in Spelljammer are the Tinker Gnomes from Dragonlance. Let's skip past. The basic idea of Spelljammer is you put a magical helm on a normal ship and it can fly, but once you get civilizations flying around in space, then they start building ships that are for space, and those ships can land on water or land or both, depending on the construction of the ship. Let's skip past all this. Okay, here's another interesting one that didn't get a ship card. The Elven Armada is like an aircraft carrier. You can see the little flitters, a little one-man craft on it. It's the Elven super ship. I really like the design of the Elven ships, and I think that the people who designed the spaceships for Babylon 5 must have been familiar with Spelljammer because it looks familiar. The Dwarven Citadel is an interesting ship. It's like basically a carved out asteroid. Okay, and here it goes in a little of the Spelljammer. I'll cover that later. And here's all the helms. And then life in space. Talks about the different races in space. Of course, like most game worlds, the main one is humans. Got 4 pages on humans. And then the Elven Armada. Another of the major races are elves, and they have this navy of these really interesting ships, and they patrol space. And they recently had a war where they drove the goblins and their kin out of space, called the Unhuman War. The dwarves fly around on asteroids they've carved out, and they use the creative energy of making things to power the ship. Lizardmen are a new player character race that are a major space race. Lizardmen from space. The gnomes are the Tinker Gnomes from Dragonlance. Halflings appear in space settlements, but they don't actually have organized nations in space. And of course, the goblin races, goblins, hobgoblins, kobolds, and ogres, have just recently been driven from space, so they exist on planets hiding, plotting their return to space. The Mind Flayers are a major race in space, and they still enslave humans and still eat their brains, but they're able to somehow act civilized enough to interact with the other players and do trade and stuff. Undead are something that fit well in space because they don't care if they run out of air. Lycanthropes could have problems in space because to get a full moon, all you got to do is fly to that side of the moon, and there are lots of moons to be full. Now, one of the most interesting concepts in this book, which didn't get used in any other for some reason, is the star beasts. They're gigantic, indestructible creatures made out of the same material as the crystal spheres, and they hold up planets. And they give some examples. A giant holding a world on its head, like Atlas. A flat world supported on the backs of 4 elephants, which are standing on the backs of 8 dragons, which are standing on a turtle, which moves the whole thing around the sun. A water world held by a huge squid. A flat world held in a huge bowl, aloft by a giant holding flowing robes, an air globe held between 2 hands that extend below the edge of the crystal sphere, a monstrous jester who juggles worlds, and whenever the worlds touch the jester's hand, then there are earthquakes, tidal waves, and mass destruction. A beholder holding a flat plane of a world above with its eye tentacles, an alligator head, jackal head, even griffin-like giants working in combination. So, Star Beast is an interesting idea, and I don't know why it didn't get used outside this book. Now, there's some new monsters. The Arcane are a race of blue giants who trade in spacefaring equipment. Another race is the Beholders. The beholders are a major race in space, and they come together in groups. And in first edition, one beholder was equal to 2 ancient dragons, but now you got whole ships full of them. The Dracon, I thought, was a really interesting race. They're sort of like a centaur, only instead of a horse body, you got a brontosaurus body, and they have a dragon head. Here's another cool picture. The Radiant Dragon is a gigantic dragon, really powerful, more powerful than planet-based dragons. This is basically a fire creature and a space ghost. And the Gith are hippopotamus people who are obsessed with guns. So they like to use guns. Okay, another cool picture. And there's the Kindori space whales, which I felt like I didn't do enough with in this game. And the Kraken or Kraken. Didn't do enough with that in the game. There's a nice mind player with a ship. The Neogi were the evil race, the major evil race. And it looks sort of like a cross between a moray eel and a wolf spider. And they keep humans and umberhawks as slaves. The umberhawks are their muscle, basically. And there's a scaver, basically space sharks. And then it goes into a tour of some of the different star systems of the major game worlds. Kryn Space is where Dragonlance takes place. It goes into a little bit about each of those planets, and then later was a book published for each of these. Gray Space is where Greyhawk is. Realm Space is where Realm Space is where Forgotten Realms and Character are. And in the back, they got a ship information thing, so you can custom. It's like a character sheet for a ship. So that's it for the Spelljammer box set, Lorebook of the Void.